The scrub brush hit the saloon floor with such force that soapy water splashed across Florence Meadows' already soaked skirts, but she barely noticed as she pressed harder against the whiskey-stained planks, her knees screaming in protest after 6 hours of this back-breaking work. The afternoon sun filtered through the grimy windows of the Red Mountain Saloon in Virginia City, Nevada, casting long shadows across the floor she had been cleaning since dawn for the pitiful sum of $2. Money she desperately needed to pay for the cramped room she shared with 3 other working women in a boarding house that smelled of mildew and desperation. It was August 1875, and the silver mining boom that had once made Virginia City glitter with promise had begun to fade, leaving behind desperate souls clinging to whatever work they could find. Florence had arrived 3 months ago from Sacramento after her father's debts had consumed everything they owned, including the small seamstress shop her mother had left her when she died. At 22 years old, she had thought she would find opportunity in Nevada, perhaps work as a seamstress or a teacher, but those positions required references and connections she did not possess. Instead, she found herself scrubbing floors, washing dishes, and doing laundry for pennies, while men who barely lifted a finger made fortunes or lost them on the turn of a card. The saloon owner, Marcus Grimsby, was a fat man with yellowed teeth and wandering hands who paid her less than he paid anyone else because, as he so eloquently put it, she had no other options. He was right, which made Florence hate him even more. She kept her head down, did her work, and tried not to think about the fact that her mother had once told her she would do great things, would marry a good man, would have a life filled with more than just survival. "You missed a spot near the bar," Grimsby called from his position near the door, not bothering to point, just enjoying the power he held over her. "And you better have this done before the evening crowd arrives, or I will dock your pay." Florence bit back the sharp retort that rose in her throat and dunked her brush back into the bucket, ignoring the way her back ached and her hands had gone raw from the harsh lye soap. She had learned quickly that talking back only made things worse, only gave men like Grimsby more reasons to push harder, pay less, demand more. So she stayed silent, scrubbed harder, and tried to remember what it felt like to have dignity. The saloon doors swung open with enough force to rattle the windows, and Florence glanced up despite herself. The man who entered had to duck slightly to clear the doorframe, his shoulders so broad they seemed to fill the entire entrance. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with long dark hair that fell past his shoulders and a beard that looked like it had not seen scissors in months. His shirt, made of worn buckskin, stretched across a chest that spoke of years spent in hard labor, and his arms, visible where the sleeves had been cut away, were thick with muscle that rippled as he moved. He wore heavy boots caked with mountain dirt and carried himself with the kind of easy confidence that came from a man who knew exactly how dangerous he could be and did not feel the need to prove it to anyone. Florence had seen mountain men before. They came down from the high country every few months to sell furs, stock up on supplies, and spend their money on whiskey and women. They were usually rough, crude, and treated everyone with the same dismissive contempt they showed the animals they trapped. But this man was different. His eyes, a startling shade of gray, swept the room with an intelligence that seemed at odds with his rough appearance, and when his gaze landed on Florence, still on her knees with her brush in hand, something shifted in his expression. Grimsby hurried forward, suddenly obsequious in the way small men always were when faced with someone who could break them in half without effort. "Welcome, welcome. What can I get you? Whiskey? A room? We have the finest accommodations in Virginia City." The mountain man did not look at Grimsby. His eyes stayed fixed on Florence, taking in her soaked dress, her raw hands, the way she knelt on the hard floor like a supplicant in a church of sin and greed. "Who is she?" His voice was deep, rough from disuse, but there was something almost gentle in the way he asked. "Her? That is just Florence, one of my workers. She is finishing the floors before the evening rush. Now, about that whiskey. How much do you pay her?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Grimsby sputtered, his face reddening. "I do not see how that is any of your business. She is my employee, and—" "How much?" There was steel in those 2 words, a promise of consequences if the answer did not come quickly. Grimsby swallowed hard. $2 for a full day's work. That is more than fair for a woman with no skills." The mountain man's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping beneath his beard. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a leather pouch that clinked with the unmistakable sound of coins. "Here's $50. Consider it her wages for the next month. She does not work for you anymore." Florence's breath caught in her throat. $50 was more money than she had seen in 6 months, more than most working women made in half a year. But the implications of what this stranger was offering made her stomach twist with familiar dread. She had heard stories of mountain men who bought women the way they bought horses, who took them up into the wilderness and treated them like property. She might be desperate, but she was not that desperate. Not yet. She stood slowly, her knees protesting, and faced the mountain man with as much dignity as she could muster while dripping with dirty water. "Thank you for your generous offer, but I cannot accept. I do not know you, and I will not trade one master for another, no matter how much gold is involved." Something flickered in those gray eyes. Respect, maybe, or surprise. He nodded slowly and turned back to Grimsby, who was eyeing the pouch of money like a starving dog eyes a bone. "She does not work for you anymore. Pay her what you owe her for today and let her go." "Now wait just a minute." The mountain man took a single step forward, and Grimsby stumbled backward so fast he nearly tripped over his own feet. "Pay her!" Grimsby fumbled in his pocket and pulled out 2 crumpled dollar bills, thrusting them at Florence like they burned his fingers. "Fine. Take your money and get out. You're fired anyway." Florence took the bills with shaking hands, years of being pushed around suddenly boiling over into something hot and bright in her chest. She looked at Grimsby, at his piggy little eyes and his cruel mouth, and allowed herself the luxury of speaking the truth. "You are a miserable, petty man, and I hope you choke on your own greed." She turned and walked toward the door before he could respond, before she lost her nerve, before the reality of being unemployed in a town with no opportunities crashed down on her. The mountain man fell into step beside her, his presence both intimidating and oddly comforting as they stepped out into the dusty street. The late afternoon sun was brutal after the dimness of the saloon, and Florence raised a hand to shield her eyes, suddenly aware that she had no plan, no idea where to go or what to do next. The $2 in her hand would barely cover her room for another week, and without work, she would be on the streets by September. "My name is Benjamin Hawthorne," the mountain man said, his voice softer now that they were away from Grimsby's hearing. "My friends call me Ben. Florence Meadows, and I appreciate what you did in there, truly, but I cannot accept charity. I need to find another position, something that will let me earn my keep." Ben looked down at her, and Florence felt small beside him, though she stood a respectable 5.5 feet. That was not charity. That was anger at watching a grown man treat another human being like something he scraped off his boot. "You should not have to kneel to anyone, Florence Meadows, not for pennies, not for dollars, not for any amount of money in the world." The words hit her like a physical blow, not because they were harsh, but because they were kind. She had grown so accustomed to cruelty, to being treated as less than, that simple human decency felt almost foreign. Tears pricked at her eyes, and she blinked them back furiously, refusing to cry in front of this stranger, no matter how gentle his words. "That's a nice sentiment," she said, forcing her voice to remain steady. "But sentiment does not pay for food or shelter. I need to work, and kneeling is sometimes part of that work. I cannot afford the luxury of pride." "What if you did not have to choose between pride and survival?" Florence laughed, a bitter sound that held no humor. "Then I would be living in a different world than this one." Ben was quiet for a long moment, his gray eyes searching her face as if trying to read something written there. Finally, he spoke. "I have a cabin up in the mountains, about 2 days' ride from here. It is nothing fancy, but it is solid and warm, and I have more space than one man needs. I also have more work than one man can handle. I trap, I hunt, I have a small herd of horses that need tending. I could use help, someone who can cook, help with the tanning, keep the place running while I am out on the trap lines. In exchange, you would have a room, food, and a fair wage, $20 a month, paid in gold." It was too good to be true, which meant it probably was not true at all. Florence crossed her arms over her chest, ignoring the way her wet dress clung to her skin. "And what else would you expect in exchange for this generous arrangement?" Ben's expression hardened. "I expect honest work for honest pay. Nothing more. I am not Grimsby, and I am not the kind of man who forces himself on women. You would have your own room with a lock on the door, and you would be free to leave whenever you wanted. I will take you into town once a month for supplies, and you can decide then if you want to stay or go. But I give you my word, Florence Meadows, you would be safe with me." Florence wanted to believe him. God, how she wanted to believe him. But she had learned through hard experience that men rarely meant what they said, especially when it came to women they viewed as beneath them. Still, what choice did she have? She could stay in Virginia City and try to find another position scrubbing floors or washing laundry for men like Grimsby. Or she could take a chance on this strange mountain man with kind eyes and a promise of something better. "I will need to collect my things from the boarding house," she said slowly, testing the words, seeing if they felt like truth or foolishness. "And I want it understood that if I come with you, it is as an employee, not as anything else. I do my work, you pay me, and we keep our relationship strictly professional." "Agreed. And if I want to leave, you bring me back to Virginia City immediately, no questions asked." "Agreed." Florence took a deep breath and made her decision, hoping it was the right one. "Then I accept your offer, Mr. Hawthorne. When do we leave?" "Tomorrow at first light. That will give you time to pack and say your goodbyes. I will meet you in front of the boarding house at dawn." He paused, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a $10 gold piece, pressing it into her hand before she could protest. "For supplies. You will need warmer clothes for the mountains, and sturdy boots. Consider it an advance on your wages." Florence stared at the gold coin, feeling its weight in her palm. It represented more than money. It represented possibility, hope, maybe even a future that did not involve kneeling on saloon floors for men like Grimsby. She closed her fingers around it and met Ben's eyes. "Thank you. I will not let you down." "I know you will not." He tipped his hat to her, a gesture so old-fashioned and courtly it seemed out of place coming from a man who looked like he wrestled bears for entertainment. "Until tomorrow, Miss Meadows." He walked away then, his long strides carrying him down the street toward the general store, leaving Florence standing in the dust with a gold coin in her hand and a strange flutter of something unfamiliar in her chest. It might have been hope, or it might have been terror. She suspected it was both. The boarding house where Florence lived was a 3-story structure that leaned slightly to the left and smelled perpetually of boiled cabbage and unwashed humanity. She shared a room on the top floor with 3 other women, all of them working various jobs around Virginia City to scrape together enough money to survive. There was Margaret, a laundress with hands as red and raw as Florence's, Catherine, who worked at the dry goods store for barely enough to cover her rent, and Sarah, who sang at one of the better saloons and occasionally supplemented her income in ways she did not talk about. When Florence climbed the narrow stairs to their room, she found all 3 women there, which was unusual for late afternoon. Margaret was mending a dress, Catherine was reading a battered copy of a dime novel, and Sarah was brushing out her long blonde hair in front of the cracked mirror they all shared. "You are back early," Margaret said, looking up from her sewing. "Did Grimsby finally work you to death and you are now a ghost come to haunt us?" "I quit," Florence said, and the words felt powerful, even if they were not entirely accurate. "Or I was fired. It amounts to the same thing." All 3 women stared at her. Sarah recovered first, setting down her brush with a clatter. "You did what? Florence, you cannot just quit. You need that job. We all need our jobs, terrible as they are." "I found something better." Florence sat down on the thin mattress she shared with Margaret, suddenly exhausted. "A mountain man offered me a position as a housekeeper at his cabin, $20 a month plus room and board." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken implications. Catherine closed her book slowly. "A mountain man offered you a position. Florence, you know what that means. You know what men like that expect from women they take up into the wilderness. He gave me his word that the arrangement would be strictly professional. I would have my own room with a lock on the door." "And you believe him?" Sarah's voice was gentle but skeptical. "Honey, men say all sorts of things when they want something. Once you are up in those mountains with no one around for miles, his word will not mean much if he decides he wants more than cooking and cleaning." Florence knew they were right to be concerned. She had the same concerns herself. But something about Ben Hawthorne had seemed different, genuine in a way she could not quite articulate. Maybe it was foolish to trust her instincts, but her instincts were all she had. He could have forced the issue in town if that was what he wanted. He could have offered money to Grimsby and taken me like property. Instead, he asked, and he gave me a choice. That has to count for something. Margaret set down her sewing and reached over to take Florence's hand. We are just worried about you. You are our friend, and we have all seen what happens to women who trust the wrong men. But we also know how desperate things are here. If you truly believe this is a better opportunity, then we will support you. Just promise us you will be careful. And if things go wrong, you get yourself back to town as fast as you can. I promise. Florence squeezed Margaret's hand, grateful for the concern, even as she felt the weight of their worry adding to her own. I'm leaving at dawn tomorrow. I need to pack and buy some supplies. The rest of the evening passed in a flurry of activity. Florence took her $10 gold piece to the general store and bought a sturdy pair of boots, 2 warm wool skirts, several cotton blouses, a heavy coat, and a wide-brimmed hat to protect her face from the mountain sun. She also purchased a small knife, which the store owner tried to talk her out of, but she insisted. If she was going into the wilderness with a man she barely knew, she wanted at least one way to defend herself if necessary. Back at the boarding house, she packed her few belongings into a worn carpet bag her mother had given her years ago. It did not take long. She owned little beyond her clothes, a few books, a silver locket with her mother's picture inside, and the stubborn hope that somewhere, somehow, life had to get better than this. She did not sleep much that night. The bed she shared with Margaret was lumpy and uncomfortable, and her mind would not stop racing through all the possible ways this decision could go wrong. But she also thought about Ben Hawthorne's words, about how she should not have to kneel to anyone, and something in her chest loosened just a little, making room for the possibility that maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something good. Dawn came cold and gray, the sun not yet high enough to burn away the chill that settled over Virginia City during the night. Florence dressed in her new clothes, feeling strange in the sturdy wool and leather after months of wearing her worn-out cotton dresses. The boots were stiff and pinched her toes, but they were solid and would protect her feet far better than the thin slippers she had been wearing. Margaret, Catherine, and Sarah all hugged her goodbye, extracting promises that she would send word when she could, that she would be careful, that she would come back if things did not work out. Florence promised all of it, meaning every word, and then hefted her carpetbag and made her way downstairs and out into the street. Ben Hawthorne was already waiting, sitting astride a massive horse that looked like it had some draft breed in its lineage. Beside him, on a lead rope, was a smaller chestnut mare with a gentle eye and a blanket strapped to her back for riding. Ben himself looked even more imposing in the early morning light, his shoulders wrapped in a heavy coat made of bear fur, his long hair pulled back from his face with a leather cord. "Good morning, Miss Meadows," he said, his breath misting in the cold air. "I hope you slept well." "Well enough," Florence lied. "Is that mare for me?" "Her name is Copper. She is steady and sure-footed, good for someone who maybe has not spent much time on horseback." He dismounted with easy grace and came over to help Florence tie her carpetbag to the saddle. "Have you ridden before?" "When I was younger. My father kept a horse for deliveries before." She trailed off, not wanting to talk about her father's failures, his debts, the way everything good in her life had crumbled to dust. "It has been a few years, but I remember the basics." "That's good enough. We will take it slow the first day, let you get used to being in the saddle again. The trail up to my cabin is not too difficult, but it is long, and we have a lot of ground to cover." He helped her mount, his hands respectful and careful, only touching her as much as necessary to ensure she was secure. Once she was settled, he swung back onto his own horse with the kind of effortless strength that suggested he had been doing this his entire life. They rode out of Virginia City as the sun broke over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink that seemed almost obscenely beautiful, given the ugliness Florence was leaving behind. She did not look back. There was nothing in that town she wanted to remember, nothing she would miss except for the 3 women who had shared her struggles and her small room. The trail led north and east, climbing steadily into the foothills of the Sierra Nevada. Ben set a moderate pace, mindful of Florence's lack of recent riding experience, and for the first few hours they rode in companionable silence. The only sounds were the steady clip-clop of the horses' hooves, the creak of leather saddles, and the occasional call of a bird from the pine trees that grew thicker as they gained elevation. Around mid-morning, Ben called a halt near a small stream that burbled down the mountainside. He helped Florence dismount, and she bit back a groan as her legs protested the unaccustomed exercise. Every muscle from her waist down seemed to be screaming, but she refused to complain. She had agreed to this journey, and she would see it through without whining like a child. "You are doing well," Ben said, as if reading her thoughts. "The first day is always the hardest. By tomorrow, your body will remember what it is supposed to do." He pulled a canteen from his saddle and offered it to her first, which she accepted gratefully. The water was cold and sweet, probably drawn from a mountain spring, and she drank deeply before handing it back. Ben took a long drink himself, then splashed some water on his face, the droplets catching in his beard like diamonds. "Can I ask you something?" Florence said, surprising herself with her boldness. "You can ask. I might not answer, but you can ask." "Why did you do it? Why did you pay Grimsby and help me? You do not know me. For all you know, I could be a terrible housekeeper and a worse cook." Ben was quiet for a long moment, his gray eyes fixed on the stream. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with old pain. "I had a sister once, younger than me by 5 years. She was sweet and kind and did not deserve any of the hardness life threw at her. After our parents died, she tried to make her way in San Francisco, thought she could find work as a seamstress or a shop girl. Instead, she found men like Grimsby, men who took advantage of her desperation and treated her like she was worth less than the dirt on their boots. By the time I found her, she was sick and broken, had been working herself to death for pennies just like you were. She died 3 months later, coughing up blood and crying because she thought she had failed our parents." Florence felt tears sting her eyes at the raw grief in his voice. "I'm so sorry, Ben. That is terrible." Her name was Alice. She would have been 25 this year. He turned to look at Florence, and his expression was fierce and sad all at once. "When I saw you on your knees in that saloon, scrubbing floors for a man who treated you like garbage, all I could see was Alice. I could not save my sister, but I could help you. Maybe that is selfish. Maybe I'm just trying to ease my own guilt. But I meant what I said yesterday. You will never have to kneel like that again. Not while I have breath in my body and gold in my pocket." Florence did not know what to say to that. No one had ever spoken to her with such fierce protectiveness, such genuine care for her well-being. It was overwhelming and terrifying and strangely wonderful all at once. "Thank you," she whispered, the words inadequate but heartfelt, "for telling me about Alice, for helping me, for all of it." Ben nodded once, sharp and final, then moved to check the horse's tack. The moment of vulnerability passed, but something had shifted between them, some understanding reached that went deeper than employer and employee. Florence felt it settle in her chest like a warm coal, small but steadily burning. They rode for the rest of the day, stopping occasionally to rest the horses and stretch their legs. The terrain grew more rugged as they climbed higher, the pines giving way to firs and the air growing thinner and colder. Florence's backside ached abominably, and her thighs felt like they were on fire, but she gritted her teeth and kept going, refusing to be the weak city woman who could not handle a simple trail ride. As the sun began to dip toward the western peaks, Ben led them off the main trail and into a small clearing surrounded by trees. A fire ring made of stone sat in the center, evidence that this was a regular camping spot for travelers heading into the high country. "We will stop here for the night," Ben said, dismounting and moving to help Florence down. This time, when her feet hit the ground, her legs buckled and she would have fallen if Ben had not caught her. His arms were solid and strong around her, and for just a moment, Florence let herself lean against his chest, too exhausted to care about propriety. "Easy," he murmured, his voice gentle. "You did well today. Better than most city folk on their first long ride. Let me get you settled, and then I will make camp." He guided her to a fallen log near the fire ring and made sure she was seated before moving to tend the horses. Florence watched him work, noting the efficient way he unsaddled both animals, checked their hooves, and led them to a patch of grass where he hobbled them for the night. Then he gathered firewood, built a fire with practiced ease, and pulled supplies from his saddlebags to make dinner. Within an hour, they were sitting beside a crackling fire, eating beans and salt pork that Ben cooked in a battered pot. It was simple food, but after a day of riding, it tasted like a feast. Florence ate hungrily, suddenly aware that she had not had a decent meal in months. The portions Grimsby had provided were barely enough to keep her standing, let alone working 12-hour days. "Tomorrow we will reach the cabin by mid-afternoon," Ben said, scraping the last of his beans from his tin plate. "It is not much to look at from the outside, but it is solid and warm. I built it myself 3 years ago after I decided I was tired of spending winters in a tent." "You have been up in these mountains for 3 years?" "Longer than that, really. I've been trapping since I was 16, but I used to move around more, following the seasons and the animals. After Alice died, I wanted something permanent, something that felt like home instead of just another temporary camp. So I found a good spot with water and shelter, and I built my cabin." "Do you ever get lonely?" The question slipped out before Florence could stop it, too personal and prying. But Ben did not seem offended. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but I prefer my own company to most people's. Humans can be cruel in ways animals never are. A bear might kill you, but it does it for food or because you threatened its cubs. It does not do it for sport or because it enjoys watching you suffer. People like Grimsby, though, they seem to take pleasure in making others miserable. I got tired of being around that kind of poison." Florence understood that sentiment more than she cared to admit. "But you came down to Virginia City. You could have stayed in your cabin and avoided all of us. I needed supplies and I had furs to sell. Plus, I was starting to talk to the horses too much. Figured that was a sign I needed some human contact, even if it was just a quick trip to town." He smiled, a rare expression that softened his rugged features. "I'm glad I came down when I did. Otherwise, I would not have met you." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning that Florence was not sure she was ready to examine too closely. Instead, she focused on finishing her food, acutely aware of Ben's presence across the fire, the way the flames cast shadows across his face and made his eyes seem to glow. After dinner, Ben spread out bedrolls on opposite sides of the fire, giving Florence as much privacy as was possible in a wilderness camp. He also handed her a small pistol, the metal cold and heavy in her palm. "Do you know how to use one of these?" he asked. "My father taught me the basics when I was young. I'm not a great shot, but I can manage." "Good. Keep it close tonight. We are far enough from civilization that predators are a real concern. If you hear anything moving around camp, wake me immediately. Do not try to handle it yourself." Florence nodded, clutching the pistol like a talisman against the darkness that pressed in around them. She had lived in cities her entire life, surrounded by buildings and people and the constant noise of civilization. The wilderness was different, full of sounds she did not recognize, and shadows that moved in ways that made her heart race. She lay down on her bedroll, fully clothed except for her boots, and pulled the blanket up to her chin. Across the fire, she could see Ben's silhouette as he settled into his own bedroll, his rifle within easy reach. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks spiraling up into the night sky, and somewhere in the distance, an owl hooted, the sound lonely and haunting. Despite her exhaustion, Florence lay awake for a long time, staring up at the stars that seemed impossibly bright without the interference of city lights. She thought about her mother, who had died when Florence was 17, and her father, who had drunk himself to death 2 years later, leaving her alone and penniless. She thought about Alice Hawthorne, who had suffered and died because the world was cruel to women with no protection and no prospects. And she thought about Ben, this strange mountain man who had appeared in her life like something out of a fairy tale, offering her a chance at something better. She did not know if she could trust him. She did not know if she could trust anyone. But lying there under the stars, listening to the crackle of the fire and the steady sound of Ben's breathing, she felt something she had not felt in a long time. She felt safe. The second day of travel was even harder than the first. Florence woke with muscles so sore she could barely move, and mounting copper required help from Ben and a significant amount of stubborn determination. But once they were underway, her body slowly remembered what it was doing, and the pain receded to a dull ache that she could mostly ignore. The trail grew steeper and more challenging as they climbed higher into the mountains. They passed through meadows filled with wildflowers, forded streams that ran clear and cold with snowmelt, and navigated narrow paths that hugged the sides of cliffs with drops that made Florence's stomach lurch. Through it all, Ben was patient and steady, pointing out landmarks and wildlife, telling stories about his years in the mountains that made this harsh landscape seem less forbidding. Around noon, they stopped to rest and water the horses near a small lake that reflected the sky like a mirror. While Ben checked the animals, Florence walked to the water's edge and knelt to splash cold water on her face. The reflection that looked back at her was almost unrecognizable. Her face was flushed from sun and wind, her hair had escaped its careful bun to hang in tangles around her shoulders, and her eyes held a brightness that had been missing for months. She looked alive. For the first time since her father's death, since the loss of everything she had known, she looked like someone who had a reason to keep fighting. "We are almost there," Ben said from behind her, his voice soft so as not to startle her. "Another hour, maybe 2, and you will see your new home." Your new home. The word sent a thrill through Florence that was equal parts excitement and terror. She stood and turned to face Ben, suddenly needing to say something, though she was not sure what. "I want you to know," she began, then paused, searching for the right words. "I want you to know that I am grateful. I know I already said it, but I do not think I can say it enough. You have given me a chance when I had none left, and I will work hard to prove that your faith in me was not misplaced." Ben's expression softened, and he reached out to gently tuck a strand of her hair behind her ear, the gesture so tender it made Florence's breath catch. "You do not have to prove anything to me, Florence. You just have to be yourself. That is more than enough." The moment stretched between them, charged with something Florence could not quite name. Then Ben stepped back, clearing his throat, and the spell was broken. "We should get moving. I want to reach the cabin before the afternoon storms roll in." They mounted and rode on, climbing higher still until Florence thought they must be near the very top of the world. The trees grew shorter and more twisted here, shaped by constant wind, and patches of snow clung to the shadowed spots despite it being August. The air was thin and cold, making each breath feel inadequate, but the views were spectacular. Florence could see for miles in every direction, an endless expanse of mountains and sky that made her feel simultaneously insignificant and part of something vast and eternal. Finally, as the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, they crested a ridge, and Florence saw the cabin. It sat in a small valley beside a rushing stream, surrounded by pines and protected on 3 sides by steep rocky slopes. The structure was larger than she had expected, built from thick logs chinked with mud and moss, with a stone chimney rising from one end. A small barn stood nearby, along with several outbuildings and a corral for the horses. "Welcome home," Ben said, and there was pride in his voice as he surveyed his domain. "It is not much compared to what you are probably used to, but it is mine. Built with my own hands, and now it is yours too, for as long as you want to stay." They rode down into the valley as the first rumbles of thunder echoed across the peaks. Ben hurried them into the barn, getting the horses unsaddled and settled just as the skies opened up and rain began to pour down in sheets. Then, he grabbed Florence's carpetbag and his own gear, and they ran through the downpour to the cabin, arriving breathless and laughing at the door. Inside, the cabin was dim but warm, smelling of wood smoke and pine. Ben quickly got a fire going in the large stone fireplace, while Florence looked around her new home. The main room was spacious, with a sturdy table and chairs near the fireplace, shelves lined with supplies and tools, and furs hanging on the walls for insulation. A ladder led up to a loft area where Ben clearly slept, and a door on the far wall opened into a smaller room. "That is your room," Ben said, gesturing to the door. "It is not large, but it has a real bed and a window with shutters. There is a bar you can put across the door from the inside if you want extra security, though I promise you will never need it." Florence walked to the door and pushed it open, peering inside. The room was small, as Ben had said, but it was clean and private. The bed was a real frame with a mattress stuffed with what smelled like pine needles and dried grass, and a thick wool blanket lay folded at the foot. A small table and chair sat beneath the window, and hooks on the wall provided space to hang clothes. It was simple, but it was hers, the first space she had been able to call her own since leaving Sacramento. "It is perfect," she said, turning to find Ben watching her with an expression she could not quite read. "Thank you, Ben, for all of this." "You do not have to keep thanking me," he said gruffly. "You are going to earn your keep, believe me. There's a lot of work to be done around here, and I was not lying when I said I needed help. But tonight, you rest. Tomorrow we will figure out a routine and divide up the chores. For now, let me make us some dinner, and you can get settled." Florence unpacked her few belongings while Ben cooked, hanging her clothes on the hooks and setting her books on the small table. The silver locket with her mother's picture went on the table beside the bed where she could see it first thing every morning. When she emerged from her room, Ben had stew bubbling over the fire and fresh bread warming on a stone near the hearth. They ate together at the table, and for the first time in years, Florence felt something close to contentment. The storm raged outside, but inside the cabin, it was warm and dry and safe. Ben told her about the land, about the trap lines he ran in winter and the vegetables he grew in summer. He explained how to identify animal tracks, how to read the weather, how to survive in a wilderness that could be beautiful and deadly in equal measure. Florence listened and asked questions, soaking up information like a sponge. She had lived her entire life in cities, where survival meant finding work and paying rent. This was a different kind of survival, one that required skills she did not possess but desperately wanted to learn. If she was going to make a life here, even temporarily, she needed to understand this world Ben inhabited. As the evening wore on and the fire burned down to embers, Florence felt exhaustion creeping up on her. Ben noticed and stood, stretching his arms above his head in a way that made his shirt pull tight across his chest. "You should get some sleep. Tomorrow will be a full day, getting you oriented to everything." Florence nodded and stood, swaying slightly with fatigue. On impulse, she reached out and touched Ben's arm, feeling the solid muscle beneath the buckskin. "Thank you," she said one more time, needing him to understand how much this meant. "For everything." Ben covered her hand with his own, his palm rough and warm. "You're welcome, Florence. Sleep well." She retreated to her small room, barred the door more out of habit than fear, and collapsed onto the bed still fully clothed. The mattress was lumpy and smelled of pine, but it was the most comfortable thing she had slept on in months. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but Florence barely heard it. She was asleep almost before her head hit the pillow, dreamless and deep. The weeks that followed fell into a rhythm that surprised Florence with its satisfaction. She woke each morning to the sound of Ben chopping wood or tending the horses, and she would dress quickly and emerge from her room to start breakfast. Ben had a decent store of supplies, flour and salt, and coffee, as well as smoked meat and vegetables from a small garden behind the cabin. Florence threw herself into cooking with an enthusiasm she had not known she possessed, creating meals that were simple but hearty, the kind of food that sustained a man who worked from dawn to dusk. After breakfast, Ben would head out to check his trap lines, or hunt or work on the various projects that maintaining a mountain homestead required. Florence would clean the cabin, wash clothes in the cold stream, tend the garden, and work on the seemingly endless task of tanning hides. Ben had taught her the process, scraping the skins clean, treating them with a mixture of the animal's own brains, stretching and working them until they became soft and supple. It was hard, messy work that left her arms aching and her hands stained, but there was something deeply satisfying about taking a raw hide and transforming it into something useful. In the evenings, they would eat together and talk. Ben taught Florence about the mountains, about the animals and plants, the weather patterns and the dangers. She taught him things too, though she had not realized she had anything to offer until she started sharing stories from the books she loved, teaching him about places and people far beyond these mountains. He listened with an attention that made her feel heard in a way she never had before, asking questions and remembering details from previous conversations. Slowly, carefully, they learned each other. Florence learned that Ben had been born in Missouri, the son of a farmer who had lost everything in a flood when Ben was 12. His family had moved west, trying to start over, but his parents had died of cholera on the trail. Only Ben and Alice had survived, two orphans in a hostile land, clinging to each other because they had no one else. Ben had worked any job he could find, from stable hand to blacksmith's apprentice, saving every penny to give Alice a chance at a better life. But it had not been enough. It was never enough. Ben learned that Florence had grown up in Sacramento, the only child of a seamstress and a freight company clerk. Her childhood had been happy, filled with books and music and her mother's gentle guidance. But her mother had died of influenza when Florence was 17, and her father had fallen apart without his wife. He had started drinking, started gambling, started making terrible decisions that destroyed everything they had built. By the time he died, Florence had nothing left except debts and the determination to survive. They were two people shaped by loss, by the cruelty of a world that took more than it gave. But here, in this small cabin high in the mountains, they were building something new, something that felt like the beginning of healing. One morning in early September, Florence woke to find the world transformed. Snow had fallen during the night, a thin layer of white that turned the valley into something magical. She stood at her window in her nightgown, staring at the beauty of it, until she heard Ben moving around in the main room. She dressed quickly and emerged to find him standing by the door, coffee in hand, looking out at the snow with a slight frown. "Is something wrong?" she asked, moving to pour her own coffee from the pot on the hearth. "Not wrong exactly, but this is early for snow, even at this elevation. It means we are in for a hard winter. I'm going to need to hunt more aggressively over the next few weeks, get enough meat stored to see us through if we get snowed in." "Is that likely? Getting snowed in, I mean." "Up here, it is almost guaranteed. Some winters I do not make it down to Virginia City for 4 or 5 months. The passes become impassable, and traveling in deep snow is too dangerous." He turned to look at her, his expression serious. "If you want to go back to town before winter sets in, now is the time. Once the heavy snows start, you would be stuck here until spring." The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Florence had been at the cabin for 6 weeks now, and in that time she had not once thought about leaving. The work was hard, but it was honest. She went to bed exhausted every night and woke feeling like she had a purpose. More than that, she had grown to enjoy Ben's company, to look forward to their evening conversations and the quiet comfort of working alongside him. But spending an entire winter alone with him, cut off from civilization, was a different matter entirely. It would be just the two of them for months, with no escape if things went wrong, no way to leave if she changed her mind. "Do you want me to leave?" she asked, needing to know. "No," the word came out firm and immediate. "But I want you to make the choice that is right for you, not the choice you think I want you to make. Winter up here is hard, Florence. The cold is brutal, and the isolation can drive you mad if you are not prepared for it. I do not want you to stay out of obligation and then come to resent me for it." Florence set down her coffee cup and walked to where Ben stood by the door. She looked up at him, at this man who had given her so much without asking for anything in return, and she knew what her answer was. I want to stay. I'm not saying it will be easy, and I'm sure there will be days when I regret this decision. But I feel more at home here in 6 weeks than I felt in Virginia City in 3 months. This place, this life, it feels right in a way nothing has in a long time. So unless you are trying to get rid of me, I want to stay through the winter." Something flickered in Ben's eyes, relief and pleasure, and something deeper that made Florence's heart beat faster. "I'm not trying to get rid of you. I just needed to make sure you understood what you were choosing." "I understand. Now, what do you need me to do to help prepare for winter?" Over the next 3 weeks, they worked harder than Florence had ever worked in her life. Ben hunted elk and deer, bringing back meat that they butchered together and stored in a small cold room dug into the hillside behind the cabin. Florence learned to make pemmican, a mixture of dried meat, fat, and berries that would keep indefinitely and provide concentrated nutrition when fresh food was scarce. They harvested the last of the vegetables from the garden, storing potatoes and turnips and onions in the cold room alongside the meat. Ben chopped wood until they had cords of it stacked against the cabin walls, enough to keep the fire burning through even the worst blizzards. Florence made candles from rendered fat, sewed warmer clothes from the hides she had tanned, and organized their supplies to make sure they had everything they would need to survive months of isolation. Through it all, they grew closer. There were moments when their hands would brush as they worked side by side, and the contact would linger just a second longer than necessary. There were evenings when their conversation would trail off into comfortable silence, and Florence would look up to find Ben watching her with an expression that made her breath catch. There were mornings when she would emerge from her room to find him already up, coffee made, and the way his face would light up when he saw her made her feel something she had not felt in years. She was falling in love with him. It was terrifying and exhilarating and completely undeniable. She did not know when it had happened, could not point to a single moment and say, "There, that is when everything changed." It had been gradual, a slow accumulation of small kindnesses and shared laughter and the deep comfort of being truly seen by another person. The question was whether Ben felt the same way. Florence thought he might. She caught him watching her sometimes with an intensity that suggested his thoughts were not entirely professional. He found excuses to touch her, a hand on her back to guide her through a doorway, fingers brushing hers as he handed her tools, the way he always made sure she had the warmest spot by the fire. But he never pushed, never crossed the line from friendship into something more, and Florence was not sure if that was because he did not feel that way or because he was trying to honor his promise that their relationship would remain professional. The first major snowstorm hit in late September, dumping 3 feet of snow on the valley in a single night. Florence woke to a world muffled in white, the cabin buried so deeply that Ben had to dig a path to the barn to tend the horses. They spent the day inside, the wind howling so loudly that conversation was difficult, and Florence found herself acutely aware of Ben's presence in a way she had not been before. The cabin suddenly seemed smaller, more intimate, and every time their eyes met across the fire, she felt heat that had nothing to do with the flames. That evening, as they sat at the table after dinner, Ben reached across and took her hand. His palm was rough and warm, and Florence's heart started to pound so hard she was sure he must be able to hear it. "Florence, I need to tell you something." Her mouth went dry. "What is it?" "These past weeks with you have been the best I have had in years, maybe the best I have had since Alice was still alive. You have brought life to this cabin, made it feel like a home instead of just a shelter. And I know I promised that our arrangement would be professional, that I would not expect anything from you beyond honest work. But I have to be honest with you now. I am falling in love with you. I might have already fallen. And if you do not feel the same way, that is fine. I will respect that. And nothing has to change. But I could not spend an entire winter with you, seeing you every day without telling you the truth." Florence stared at him, her mind racing. He loved her. Ben Hawthorne, this mountain man who had saved her from a life of degradation and given her a chance at something better, loved her. It seemed impossible and perfect all at once. "Say something," Ben said, his voice rough with vulnerability, "even if it is just to tell me I'm a fool." "You are not a fool." Florence's voice came out barely above a whisper. "I'm falling in love with you too. I've been for weeks, but I was afraid to say anything. I thought maybe I was just grateful or confused or projecting feelings that were not really there. But they are there, Ben. They are so there it terrifies me." Ben's grip on her hand tightened. "Why does it terrify you? Because what if I am wrong? What if this is just proximity and gratitude, and I wake up in a few months realizing I made a terrible mistake? What if I hurt you the way I have been hurt? What if, Ben cut her off by standing and pulling her to her feet, wrapping his arms around her in a way that made her feel small and protected and cherished? What if none of those things happen? What if this is real and right and exactly what we both need? Florence, I have lived alone for years because I did not think I could trust anyone enough to let them close. But you have proven me wrong. You work harder than anyone I have ever met. You are brave and smart and strong, and you make me laugh in ways I had forgotten I could. I am not asking you to marry me tomorrow or promise me forever. I'm just asking you to let this be what it is, to let us see where it goes. Can you do that?" Florence buried her face in his chest, breathing in the scent of wood smoke and pine and something uniquely Ben. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I can do that." He pulled back just enough to look down at her, his gray eyes searching her face. Then, slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he lowered his head and kissed her. It was gentle at first, almost tentative, as if he was afraid she might disappear. But when Florence responded, rising on her toes and wrapping her arms around his neck, the kiss deepened into something that made her knees weak and her heart sore. His beard was soft against her face, his lips warm and sure, and when they finally broke apart, they were both breathing hard. "That was Florence could not find the words. Yes, Ben agreed, resting his forehead against hers. It really was. They stood like that for a long moment, holding each other, listening to the wind howl outside and the fire crackle in the hearth. Then Ben stepped back, his hands sliding down her arms to clasp her fingers. "We should take this slowly," he said. "I do not want to rush you or make you feel pressured. You still have your room, and nothing has to change unless you want it to." What if I wanted to change? The words surprised Florence, but she realized they were true. She had spent so long being careful, being afraid, protecting herself from hurt. But Ben made her want to be brave. He made her want to risk her heart for the chance at something real. "Then we figure it out together." He kissed her forehead, tender and sweet. "But not tonight. Tonight we just enjoy knowing that we feel the same way. The rest can come in its own time." Florence nodded, knowing he was right even as part of her wanted to throw caution to the wind. They said goodnight with another kiss, shorter but no less sweet, and Florence retreated to her room with her heart so full she thought it might burst. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of the evening. Ben loved her. She loved him. It seemed too simple, too perfect. But maybe that was okay. Maybe after all the hardship and loss, she was allowed something simple and perfect. Maybe they both were. The winter settled in with a vengeance, bringing storms that buried the valley under blankets of snow and cold that made breathing hurt. But inside the cabin, Florence and Ben created their own world, one defined by growing intimacy and deepening love. They worked together during the day, cooking and cleaning and caring for the animals. They spent evenings by the fire, talking and reading and simply enjoying each other's company. And slowly, carefully, they explored the physical aspect of their relationship. It started with kisses that grew longer and more heated, hands that wandered from safe places to more daring ones. Ben was always gentle, always patient, letting Florence set the pace and never pushing for more than she was ready to give. When she finally came to him one night in December, standing at the foot of the ladder that led to his loft with her heart in her throat, he simply held out his hand and helped her climb up. They made love by firelight, slow and tender, learning each other's bodies the way they had learned each other's hearts. Afterward, Florence lay in Ben's arms, her head on his chest, listening to the steady thump of his heartbeat and feeling more content than she had ever felt in her life. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness. "I love you too." Ben's arms tightened around her. "More than I have words to say." From that night on, Florence slept in the loft with Ben, her small room below becoming storage for supplies. They fell into the rhythms of a couple, learning each other's habits and quirks, fighting occasionally, and making up with kisses that led to more. The winter that Florence had feared would be isolating and difficult became instead a time of joy. The two of them cocooned in their cabin while the world outside raged with cold and snow. In January, Ben asked her to marry him. They were sitting by the fire, Florence mending one of his shirts and Ben oiling a harness, when he suddenly set down his work and turned to her. "Florence, I know we have not known each other long by most standards, but I have lived enough years to know when something is right. You are right for me in every way that matters. You make me want to be better, make me grateful for every day I get to spend with you. I want to marry you, build a life with you, grow old with you. Will you be my wife?" Florence set down the shirt with shaking hands, tears streaming down her face. "Yes," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." They married themselves that night, standing before the fire with only God and the mountains as witnesses. They spoke their vows with absolute sincerity, promising to love and honor and cherish each other for as long as they both lived. Ben took a thin gold band from his pocket, a ring that had belonged to his mother, and slid it onto Florence's finger. "I have been carrying this since Virginia City," he admitted. "I did not know if I would ever have the courage to give it to you, but I hoped." "It is perfect." Florence held up her hand, watching the firelight catch on the simple band. "You are perfect. This is perfect." They consummated their marriage with a passion that left them both breathless and laughing, and Florence fell asleep that night as Mrs. Benjamin Hawthorne, a name that filled her with pride and joy. The winter eventually gave way to spring, the snow melting to reveal the valley in all its green glory. Ben and Florence emerged from their cocoon, blinking in the bright sunlight, and marveling at how much the world had changed while they had been focused on each other. They planted a larger garden, expanded the corral for the horses, and made plans for the future. In May, Ben took Florence down to Virginia City to officially register their marriage and pick up supplies. She wore her wedding ring proudly, and when they passed the Red Mountain Saloon, she held her head high. Marcus Grimsby was nowhere to be seen, and Florence did not bother asking about him. That part of her life was over, buried as thoroughly as the winter snow. They stopped at the boarding house, and Florence was delighted to find Margaret, Catherine, and Sarah all still there. The women greeted her with shrieks of joy and 1,000 questions about her mountain man and her new life. Florence answered honestly, telling them about the cabin and the work and the love she had found with Ben. "You look happy," Margaret said, taking both of Florence's hands in hers. "Truly happy in a way you never did when you lived here." "I am happy," Florence confirmed, "happier than I have ever been. Ben is a good man, a kind man, and he treats me like I am precious. I never have to kneel for anyone anymore, not literally and not figuratively. I am his equal in all ways, and that makes all the difference." The women cried and hugged her and made her promise to visit whenever she could. Florence agreed, though she knew visits would be rare given the distance and the difficulty of the journey. But she also knew she was not the same desperate, broken woman who had scrubbed floors for pennies. She was Florence Hawthorne now, mountain woman, wife to Benjamin Hawthorne, and she had a life that was full and rich and entirely her own. They returned to the cabin laden with supplies and a few luxuries Ben had insisted on buying, including fabric for new dresses and a set of books Florence had been eyeing. As they rode up the mountain trail, Florence looked back at Virginia City one last time, feeling nothing but gratitude that she had escaped and found her way to something better. The summer was glorious, full of work and laughter, and long evenings spent sitting outside the cabin, watching the sun set over the mountains. In September, Florence realized she was pregnant, a discovery that filled her with equal parts terror and joy. She had never thought much about children, had assumed they were something that would happen eventually if she ever found stability. But now, carrying Ben's child, she found herself excited for this new chapter. Ben was over the moon when she told him, picking her up and spinning her around until she shrieked with laughter and insisted he put her down before he hurt the baby. He became even more protective than usual, insisting she rest more and work less, though Florence largely ignored his fussing and continued her regular routine. She felt strong and healthy, her body thriving on the good food and clean air and the love that surrounded her every day. Their daughter was born in late May of 1877, delivered by Ben with shaking hands and more fear than he had shown facing down grizzly bears. But he did well, and Florence did well, and when he placed the tiny, squalling infant in her arms, they both cried at the perfection of her. "Alice," Florence said, looking down at the baby's scrunched red face. "Her name is Alice." Ben's eyes filled with tears. "Are you sure? I do not want you to feel obligated. I am sure. Your sister deserved better than the life she got, and this little girl deserves to carry a name that means something. We will raise her to be strong and brave and kind, everything your Alice wanted to be but did not get the chance." Ben kissed Florence's forehead, then their daughter's. "Thank you," he whispered, "for everything. For being my wife, for giving me this family, for making my life more than I ever dreamed it could be." "You did the same for me," Florence reminded him. "You saw me scrubbing floors for pennies and decided I deserved better. You gave me a chance when no one else would. You loved me when I did not think I was worthy of being loved. This life we have, this family, it is something we built together." They sat like that for a long time, the three of them tangled together in the bed, listening to the sounds of the mountain spring and feeling more blessed than either of them had any right to be. Baby Alice grew into a toddler, full of energy and curiosity that kept Florence and Ben constantly on their toes. She had her mother's dark hair and her father's gray eyes, and she was utterly fearless in a way that both delighted and terrified her parents. Ben taught her to ride almost as soon as she could walk, settling her in front of him on his horse and taking her on gentle rides around the valley. Florence taught her to identify plants and birds, to cook simple meals, and to read from the books that had once belonged to Florence's mother. In the winter of 1879, Florence gave birth to a son they named James, after Ben's father. He was quieter than Alice had been, more contemplative, and he grew into a boy who preferred books and careful observation to his sister's wild adventures. But he adored Alice, following her everywhere with patient devotion, and she in turn was fiercely protective of her little brother. The cabin that had once housed just Ben felt full in the best possible way. There was always someone laughing or crying or needing something, and the quiet solitude Ben had once craved was replaced by the joyful chaos of family. They expanded the cabin, adding another room for the children and improving the barn to house more animals as their little homestead grew. Florence had never forgotten her promise to herself that she would never kneel for anyone again, and she kept it. She worked hard, but it was work that mattered, work that built something rather than just surviving. She made decisions alongside Ben, their partnership equal in all ways. When challenges arose, as they inevitably did, they faced them together. When joy came, they shared it equally. Years passed in a blur of seasons, each one bringing new adventures and challenges. Alice grew into a young woman as strong and capable as her mother, as at home in the wilderness as any mountain man. James became a scholar of sorts, keeping detailed journals of the plants and animals around their homestead, and talking about maybe going to college someday, though he always insisted he would come back to the mountains when he was done. On a summer evening in 1890, Florence and Ben sat on the porch they had built years ago, watching the sunset over the peaks. They were both in their late 30s now, no longer the desperate woman and solitary mountain man who had found each other in a Virginia City saloon. They were weathered and strong, their hands calloused and their faces lined with years of smiling and squinting into mountain sun. "Do you ever regret it?" Ben asked, reaching over to take Florence's hand. It was a question he had asked before, usually late at night when he worried that he had taken her from civilization and trapped her in a life she never wanted. "Never," Florence said, and she meant it with every fiber of her being. "Not for a single second. This life, this family, you, it is everything I ever wanted and so much more than I ever dared to hope for. You saved me, Ben, not just from Grimsby and that saloon, but from a life where I thought I had to kneel to survive. You taught me that I could stand tall, that I was worthy of love and respect and a life that meant something." "You did the same for me," Ben said, squeezing her hand. "I was so angry before I met you, so bitter about everything I had lost. But you reminded me that there was still good in the world, still reasons to hope. You gave me a family, a purpose, a reason to build instead of just survive." They sat in comfortable silence, watching as Alice and James came walking up from the stream, laughing about something only they understood. The sight of their children, healthy and happy and safe, filled Florence with a contentment so deep it felt like peace. I love you," she said to Ben, the words as true now as they had been the first time she said them all those years ago. "I love you too," Ben replied. "Always have, always will." As the sun dipped below the mountains and the stars began to appear, Florence Hawthorne reflected on the journey that had brought her here. From desperate woman scrubbing floors for pennies to wife and mother and full partner in a life well lived, she had traveled further than the miles from Virginia City to this mountain cabin. She had traveled from hopelessness to joy, from degradation to dignity, from merely surviving to truly living. And she had done it all standing tall, just as Ben had promised that first day in the saloon. She would never kneel again, not for any man, not for any amount of money, not for anything. She was Florence Hawthorne, mountain woman, beloved wife, devoted mother, and she had finally found her place in the world. The years continued to unfold with the steady rhythm of mountain life. The seasons turned, bringing their familiar cycle of planting and harvesting, hunting and preserving, harsh winters and glorious summers. Florence and Ben grew older, their children grew up, and the cabin that had once been a bachelor's rough shelter became a true family home, filled with memories and love and the kind of deep contentment that comes from a life well lived. In 1895, when Alice was 18, a young man named Thomas Brennan came into the mountains looking for work. He was a good man, hard-working and respectful, and it was clear from the first moment he saw Alice that he was smitten. Ben was predictably protective, putting Thomas through a series of tests that bordered on hazing, but the young man passed with flying colors. He was patient with Alice's independence, admired her strength rather than being threatened by it, and treated her with the kind of respect Ben had always shown Florence. When Thomas asked for Alice's hand in marriage, Ben looked to Florence first, silently checking with his wife before giving his answer. It was a small gesture, but one that spoke volumes about the partnership they had maintained throughout their marriage. Florence nodded her approval, and Ben gave his blessing, though not without a stern lecture about how he expected Thomas to treat his daughter. The wedding was a simple affair held in the valley, with a few neighbors from distant homesteads making the trek to celebrate. Florence wore her best dress and her mother's silver locket, and she cried happy tears as she watched her fierce, beautiful daughter marry a man who clearly adored her. Alice and Thomas built their own cabin a few miles away, close enough to visit, but far enough to have their own space. And Florence watched her daughter step into married life with the same strength and independence she had learned from watching her mother. James, meanwhile, did go to college, studying botany at a university in California. But true to his word, he returned to the mountains after graduation, building a small cabin of his own and dedicating himself to documenting the plant life of the Sierra Nevada. He never married, seeming content with his work and his family, though Florence suspected he might be a bit lonely sometimes. But he was happy in his way, and that was what mattered. By the turn of the century, Florence and Ben were in their late 40s, grandparents to Alice's 2 children, and still very much in love. They moved a bit slower now, their joints complaining on cold mornings, but they were healthy and strong, their lives rich with purpose and connection. One evening in the spring of 1900, as they sat by the fire in the cabin that had been their home for 25 years, Ben pulled out a piece of paper he had been working on and handed it to Florence. "What is this?" she asked, unfolding the page to see Ben's careful handwriting. "A deed. I'm officially putting your name on the property, making you equal owner of everything we have built here. It should have been done years ago, but I wanted to make it official now. This is your home, Florence, as much as it is mine. More, actually, because you are the one who made it a home instead of just a shelter." Florence's eyes filled with tears as she read the document. It was a small gesture in some ways. She had always felt like this was her home, her land, her life. But seeing it written down, seeing her name legally tied to this place, felt significant. It was one more way Ben showed her that she was his equal, his partner, the person he trusted with everything he had. "Thank you," she whispered, setting the paper aside and moving to sit in Ben's lap, something she still did, even though they were middle-aged and no longer quite as spry as they used to be. "For this, for everything, for 25 years of loving me and treating me like I matter." "You do matter," Ben said, wrapping his arms around her. "You are the most important thing in my life, and you always have been. From the moment I saw you on your knees in that saloon, I knew you were special. I just did not know how special until I got to know you, until I fell in love with you, until I built a life with you. You are extraordinary, Florence Hawthorne, and I thank God every day that I was brave enough to walk into that saloon when I did." They sat like that for a long time, holding each other and reflecting on the journey they had taken together. From desperate beginnings to a life full of love and family and purpose, they had created something beautiful against all odds. More years passed, bringing the joys and sorrows that come with a long life. Ben's old hunting injuries began to bother him more, and Florence developed arthritis in her hands that made some tasks difficult. But they adapted, helping each other through the challenges, never losing the deep connection that had sustained them through so many years. Their grandchildren grew, bringing them great joy. Alice had 3 children in total, all of them as wild and independent as their mother, and they would come visit the cabin Florence and Ben had built, listening wide-eyed to stories of how their grandparents had met and fallen in love. Florence always made sure to tell the girls that they should never have to kneel for anyone, that they were worthy of respect and love and a life lived on their own terms. She wanted them to know what she had learned through hard experience, that a woman's worth was not determined by men who would use her, but by her own strength and character. In 1910, on a crisp autumn evening very much like the one when they had first become intimate, Florence and Ben celebrated their 35th wedding anniversary. Alice and her family came to visit, along with James, and they had a feast featuring venison Ben had hunted and vegetables from Florence's garden. After dinner, as the younger generation cleaned up and the grandchildren played, Florence and Ben slipped outside to their porch. The valley was painted in autumn colors, gold and red and orange, and the air had that particular clarity that only came in fall. Florence leaned against Ben, feeling the solid warmth of him, marveling that she still loved him as deeply as she had when they were young, maybe even more so after all these years. "We did well," Ben said softly, his arm around her shoulders. "Built a good life, raised good children, loved each other through everything." "We did," Florence agreed, "and I would not change a single thing. Well, maybe I would skip the winter of '78 when we both had influenza and thought we might die. That was not my favorite time." Ben chuckled, the sound rumbling through his chest. "Fair point. But even then, being sick together was better than being alone. Everything is better with you, Florence, even the hard times." "Even the hard times," Florence echoed, knowing it was true. They grew old together, as they had promised they would, their love deepening with each passing year. Ben's hair turned completely white, and Florence's hands became gnarled with arthritis, but their minds stayed sharp and their hearts stayed connected. When Ben finally passed in the winter of 1918, dying peacefully in his sleep at the age of 63, Florence grieved deeply, but without regret. They had been given 43 years together, which was more than many couples ever got, and every single one of those years had been filled with love. Alice and James wanted Florence to come live with one of them, but she refused. This cabin, this valley, this was her home, the place she had built with Ben, and she was not leaving it. She stayed in the mountains, still tending her garden, still taking care of herself, still strong and independent even in her grief. She would sit on the porch in the evenings, wrapped in one of Ben's old coats, and remember. She remembered the first time she saw him in the Red Mountain Saloon, the way his eyes had looked at her with such kindness when she was on her knees scrubbing floors. She remembered his words, "You will never kneel again, not for any," and how he had kept that promise, lifting her up and treating her as an equal for every day of their marriage. She remembered their wedding night, the birth of their children, the quiet mornings and busy afternoons and peaceful evenings that had made up their life together. Most of all, she remembered how much she had loved him and how much he had loved her in return. Florence lived another 7 years after Ben's passing, dying quietly in her sleep in the summer of 1925 at the age of 72. Alice and James were with her during her final weeks, and she spent those days surrounded by her children and grandchildren, telling stories about Ben and about the life they had built together. She made sure her granddaughters understood that they should never settle for less than they deserved, never kneel for anyone, never let the world tell them they were worth less than they were. When she died, they buried her beside Ben on a small hill overlooking the valley they had loved. The grave markers were simple, just their names and dates, but they did not need anything more. Their legacy was not in stone markers, but in the children and grandchildren they had raised, in the values they had instilled, in the love they had shared so generously. Years later, long after Florence and Ben had both passed, their great-granddaughter would stand in that same valley and tell her own children about their ancestors. She would tell them about a mountain man who had walked into a saloon and seen a woman scrubbing floors for pennies, and how he had promised her that she would never kneel again. She would tell them about how he had kept that promise, how they had built a life together based on love and respect and equal partnership. She would tell them that this was the kind of love worth fighting for, the kind of life worth building, the kind of legacy worth preserving. And in that telling and retelling, Florence Meadows Hawthorne and Benjamin Hawthorne would live on, their love story a testament to the power of kindness, the importance of dignity, and the transformative nature of seeing another person's worth when the rest of the world would look away. The cabin still stood, weathered but solid, a monument to everything they had built together. And on quiet evenings when the wind blew just right through the valley, you could almost hear the echo of their laughter, the sound of two souls who had found each other against all odds and created something beautiful that would last long after they were gone. Their story was not one of grand gestures or dramatic rescues in the traditional sense. It was quieter than that, more profound. It was the story of one person seeing another's humanity and choosing to honor it. It was the story of two people choosing each other every day, through good times and hard times, through youth and age, through joy and sorrow. It was the story of a woman who learned to stand tall and a man who had always known she should. And it was, from beginning to end, a love story for the ages, born in a saloon in Virginia City and nurtured in a cabin high in the Sierra Nevada, where a mountain man and a woman who once scrubbed floors for pennies built a life that proved love, respect, and partnership could overcome anything the world threw at them. It was, quite simply, the story of two people who loved each other well, and in doing so showed generations to come what love should look like. Not love that demanded submission or required one person to kneel before another, but love that lifted both people up, that made them better and stronger together than they ever could have been apart. And that, in the end, was the greatest legacy of all.